Ethan Bennett had exactly 4 rules for surviving a catering gig gone sideways, and by 6:47 a.m. on the Saturday before Thanksgiving, he had already broken 3 of them. Rule 1, never agree to cook for a stranger's family without a signed contract. Rule 2, never let a client's relative into the kitchen. Rule 3, never, under any circumstances, leave a 22-pound turkey unattended near an open window. He was violating all 3 at once, standing in the frozen driveway of a rented brownstone in Hudson Heights in his socks, staring at a man who was, at that very moment, walking away with his turkey. "Hey!" Ethan's voice cracked on the syllable, humiliatingly, the way it hadn't since he was 15. "That's a $400 bird!" The man stopped. He turned, and Ethan's brain, which had been running on caffeine and panic for the last 6 hours, simply stalled out. He was tall. Tall in the specific load-bearing way that made door frames look apologetic, with dark hair that the wind had rearranged into something no salon could bill for, and a wool coat that had clearly never once brushed against a supermarket sale rack. He held the turkey the way other men held briefcases, like it was simply an extension of his own competence. This turkey, the man said, with the calm of someone reading a weather report, was sitting on a window ledge in 28-degree weather, with a raccoon inspecting it. I made an executive decision. You made an executive decision to steal my client's Thanksgiving dinner. I made an executive decision to rescue it. There's a difference. He glanced down at the bird, then back at Ethan, and something flickered behind his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or the specific male satisfaction of being right about something trivial. You're welcome, by the way. Ethan became aware, all at once, of several things: that his socks were now soaked through with slush, that he had a smear of cranberry reduction on his jaw, and that the man was, quite unfairly, gorgeous in the unbothered way of someone who had never had to run 6 blocks after a bird thief in his life. "Give it back," Ethan said, holding out both arms like a man requesting the return of a kidnapped child. "I will," the stranger said, "if you tell me why a 22-pound turkey was sitting outside unsupervised in the first place. I've been standing on this corner for 10 minutes and no one came looking for it. For all I knew, it had been abandoned. It was brining. In the cold, because some genius, Ethan jabbed a thumb at himself, since apparently he was the genius in question, has 6 burners and a broken walk-in and had to improvise." The man's mouth curved, slow and unhurried, like he had all the time in the world to watch Ethan unravel on a sidewalk in his socks. "You're the caterer. I'm the caterer whose turkey you just abducted, yes?" "Nathaniel," he said, and held out a hand, the one not currently cradling 22 pounds of poultry. "Everyone calls me Nate." Ethan looked at the offered hand, then at the turkey, then back at the hand, and decided that dignity was a luxury he could not currently afford. He shook it. Nate's grip was warm despite the cold, and Ethan felt something in his chest do a small, undignified somersault, the kind he usually reserved for the moment a soufflé didn't collapse. "Ethan," he muttered, "now can I please have my bird back?" "On one condition." Nate's dark eyes held his, entirely too steady for a man who had just been caught red-handed in an act of Thanksgiving larceny. "You tell me what you're making with it. I have a professional interest." "You're a chef?" "No," Nate said, and something guarded passed over his face, there and gone so fast Ethan almost missed it. "I just like to know what I'm apologizing for stealing." It was, Ethan would later admit, much later, in a kitchen 3 states away, with this same infuriating man's arms around his waist, the worst possible way to fall for someone. And also, somehow, exactly right. The rest of that Thanksgiving weekend passed in the usual blur of butter and déjà vu. Ethan didn't see Nate again, didn't get a number, didn't even get a last name, and told himself firmly that it didn't matter, because men who stole poultry off window ledges for sport were clearly unserious people, and Ethan Bennett, 27 years old and one bad landlord away from finally opening his own restaurant, did not have time for unserious people. He told himself this 3 more times over the following 2 weeks, mostly while making eye contact with his own reflection in the walk-in's fogged glass door. "You're doing the thing again," said Marcus, who had been Ethan's best friend since culinary school and his sous chef for the last 2 years, and who had therefore earned the right to say things like that without flinching. "What thing?" "The thing where you get a look on your face like you're doing algebra, except it's actually about a guy." Marcus slid a tray of croissants into the oven and shut the door with his hip. "Turkey guy?" "There is no turkey guy. There was a turkey incident. It's closed." "Uh-huh." Marcus didn't even look up. You've told me about the turkey incident 4 times. Ethan was saved from having to defend himself by the ring of his cell phone, an unknown number, area code local, which he answered mostly out of professional habit, since unknown numbers were sometimes people willing to pay him actual money to cook. Bennett Catering. Is this Ethan? The voice was crisp, businesslike, faintly amused in a way that made the back of Ethan's neck prickle with recognition before his brain had even placed it. This is Grace Whitfield. I'm calling on behalf of Nathaniel Calloway. Ethan set down the whisk he'd been holding. I'm sorry, Calloway, as in Calloway Industries, yes. A pause, brisk and efficient. Mr. Calloway would like to hire you for a private position. Live-in personal chef, 6-week trial to start, for his father, Walter Calloway, at the family estate upstate. The position pays considerably more than catering work, I should mention, and includes housing. Ethan's first thought was, Nathaniel Calloway. The name detonated softly in his memory. He'd seen it on the spine of business magazine at the dentist's office. Something about a family logistics and shipping empire, a reclusive heir who'd taken the company fully private rather than go public. A man photographed exactly twice in the last 5 years, both times looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. His second thought, arriving half a beat later and with considerably more heat, was, Turkey guy. Why me? Ethan asked. Because it was the only sane question available. I run a catering company out of Queens. I'm not exactly, he gestured vaguely, uselessly at the phone. Calloway Industries caliber. Mr. Calloway specifically requested you, Grace said, in the tone of someone reading a line she found faintly ridiculous herself. He said, and I'm quoting directly, that you make a turkey worth stealing. Ethan closed his eyes. Somewhere behind him, Marcus made a sound like a kettle reaching boil. Tell him, Ethan said slowly, that I'll need to see the kitchen first. That night, after closing, Ethan called Marcus back from the empty kitchen just to say it out loud to someone. A live-in chef job. For an actual billionaire's father. Because the son stole my turkey, and apparently hasn't shut up about it since. You have to take it, Marcus said without a beat of hesitation. I have a business here, Marcus. I have you. I have a lease. You have a business that's barely breaking even in a kitchen with a walk-in that dies twice a month. And you have me, who will absolutely still be here running the catering side while you go cook chicken soup for a rich old man for 6 weeks. Take the money. Save it. Come back, and let's actually open the restaurant we've been talking about since we were 22. Marcus's voice softened. And if the CEO happens to be unfairly attractive, that's just a bonus. Not a reason to say no. I never said he was unfairly attractive. You didn't have to. It's been in your voice for 2 weeks straight. Ethan hung up smiling despite himself, and did not sleep particularly well that night, for reasons that had very little to do with the walk-in. The Calloway estate was called Willow Ridge, and it sat at the end of 2 miles of private road in the hills above the Hudson, the kind of property that didn't announce its money so much as assume you already knew about it. Stone walls, black iron gates, a house that had clearly been built in an era when architects were still allowed to have opinions. Ethan arrived on a gray Tuesday with 1 duffel bag, 2 knife rolls, and a stomach full of nerves that had nothing whatsoever to do with the job interview and everything to do with the possibility of seeing Nate again. He needn't have worried or hoped, depending on how you counted it. Nate wasn't there. Mr. Calloway is in the city for the week, said the older woman who met him at the door, silver hair pinned back, apron over a cardigan, eyes that did a single sweeping assessment of Ethan and seemed to file him under acceptable before he'd even opened his mouth. I'm Mrs. Dobbins. I run the house. You'll be cooking for Mr. Walter. Right. The father. Ethan adjusted his knife roll on his shoulder, trying to look like a professional and not like a man who'd spent the 90-minute train ride composing increasingly unhinged text messages he never sent. Is he particular? About food? Mrs. Dobbins's mouth did something complicated. You'll see. You'll see turned out to mean. Walter Calloway was 79 years old, sharp as a boning knife, recovering from a stroke that had left his left hand slow and his patience shorter, and profoundly, magnificently uninterested in eating anything that wasn't, in his words, food, not a science project. The first 3 chefs Willow Ridge had hired that year had lasted a combined total of 11 days. Ethan found Walter in a sunroom at the back of the house, a blanket over his knees despite the radiator hissing away beneath the window, glaring at a crossword like it had personally wronged him. You're smaller than I expected, Walter said without looking up. The last one was built like a linebacker and still couldn't make a decent chicken soup. I can make chicken soup, Ethan said. Everyone says that. Walter finally looked at him, pale blue eyes, sharp as his son's had been on that sidewalk, and Ethan felt the family resemblance land somewhere behind his ribs. My daughter-in-law that isn't yet keeps sending me people who studied under men with 3 Michelin stars, and none of them can make soup that tastes like my mother made. You know why? Why? Because they're all trying to impress me instead of feed me. Walter set down his pencil. Which one are you going to do? Ethan thought about it, really thought, the way he thought about a dish before he touched a single ingredient. Neither, he said finally. I'm going to ask you what your mother put in it, and then I'm going to make it exactly that way, badly, the first 2 times, until I get it right. That's how you actually cook someone's mother's soup. You don't impress it. You earn it. For a long moment, Walter just looked at him. Then slowly, something in the old man's face unlocked. Not quite a smile, but its foundation. Huh, Walter said. You might last longer than a week. He lasted considerably longer than a week. By the end of the first month, Ethan had learned the rhythm of Willow Ridge the way he learned a new kitchen, where the light fell best in the mornings, which floorboard in the hall creaked, that Walter took his coffee at 6 sharp and pretended not to need help with the jar lids, that Mrs. Dobbins secretly loved being teased and would deny it to her grave. He'd made the chicken soup 4 times before Walter closed his eyes over the 5th bowl and said quietly, "There it is," in a voice that made Ethan step out onto the back porch afterward just to breathe. He called Marcus most Sundays, phone propped against a mixing bowl while he prepped for the week ahead. "So how's rich people land?" Marcus asked, the static of the subway crackling faintly behind his voice. "Quiet, green, there's an actual gate. Walter's growing on me, which I did not expect. He insulted my knife skills for 20 straight minutes yesterday, and then told Mrs. Dobbins I was the first one worth keeping. And the son? Still in the city. I've seen him for exactly 90 seconds since I got here, and that was through a car window." Uh-huh. Ethan could hear the grin in Marcus's voice even through bad reception. "And how many times have you thought about him since? I'm hanging up now. That's not a number, Ethan." He hung up, anyway, laughing, and went back to the soup, because there was, admittedly, no honest answer to that question that wouldn't have proven Marcus's point entirely. What he hadn't learned, what nobody at Willow Ridge seemed inclined to tell him, was anything at all about Nathaniel Calloway, who called the house most evenings to speak to his father for exactly 9 minutes, and who Ethan had not seen, not once, in 5 weeks. "He's not avoiding you," Mrs. Dobbins said one evening when Ethan finally worked up the nerve to ask, as casually as he could manage while very deliberately not looking up from the risotto he was stirring. "He's just always like this before the Fielding merger closes. Buried. I wasn't asking because Ethan started." "Of course you weren't," Mrs. Dobbins said, entirely too kindly, and went back to folding napkins with the serene expression of a woman who had already picked out china patterns in her head. He finally saw Nate again on a Friday in the 2nd week of December, and it happened exactly the way Ethan should have expected, given how their entire acquaintance had begun, badly and at an unreasonable hour, over food. Ethan had stayed up late prepping for Walter's Sunday dinner, a standing rib roast that needed a 12-hour dry brine, and had just pulled a tray of rosemary shortbread out of the oven, more out of restlessness than necessity, when he heard the front door. He assumed it was Mrs. Dobbins, back from her sister's. It was not Mrs. Dobbins. Nate came into the kitchen still in his coat, tie loosened, looking like a man who had aged 4 years in the 5 weeks since Ethan had last seen him, and stopped dead in the doorway at the sight of Ethan standing there in a flour-dusted apron with a spatula in one hand. "You're real," Nate said, which was such a strange thing to say that Ethan actually laughed. "Last I checked. Long day? You have no idea." Nate dropped into a chair at the kitchen island, like his legs had simply stopped negotiating with him, and put his head briefly in his hands. When he looked up again, there was something almost boyish in his exhaustion, all his careful executive polish stripped away by fatigue. "The Fielding deal fell through 2 hours ago, 9 months of work. Gone, because their board decided at the last minute that our logistics division wasn't synergistic enough, which is corporate, for we found someone who'll pay us more to walk away." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, and meant it, and then, because it was midnight and he was covered in flour and some things simply happened before you could stop them, he set the tray of shortbread down in front of Nate. "Eat something." You look like you're about to fall face first into the granite. Nate looked at the shortbread, then at Ethan, with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. You made this? I made it about 4 minutes ago because I couldn't sleep. It's not fancy. It's rosemary and butter and a little too much salt, probably, because I wasn't paying close attention. Nate picked up a piece and ate it in 2 bites, eyes closing briefly, and when he opened them again, some of the gray exhaustion had loosened around the edges. This is the first thing I've had all day that wasn't cold coffee. That's genuinely tragic. You run a whole company and you can't remember to eat lunch? I had a call with Tokyo at what should have been lunch, and a call with the board at what should have been dinner. By the time I remembered I was hungry. The only thing open near the office was a gas station, and I have a policy. A policy against gas station food? A policy against being photographed buying gas station food at 11 p.m. Looking like I'm having a breakdown, yes. A faint, tired smile. The tabloids already think I'm a hermit who never leaves his house. I don't need to give them, and also apparently feral. Ethan huffed out a laugh before he could stop himself, and something in Nate's face eased further at the sound of it, like he'd been waiting all night for a reason to. Sit, Ethan said, already turning for the stove. I've got short rib in the fridge from tonight, and I am not letting the CEO of Calloway Industries subsist on shortbread and self-pity in my kitchen. Your kitchen, Nate repeated, something warm threading through his voice. For the next 5 weeks, yeah. It's mine. Ethan glanced back over his shoulder and found Nate already watching him with an expression that made his pulse do something entirely unprofessional. What? Nothing. Nate shook his head slowly, like he was clearing it. It's just, my father hasn't sounded this happy on the phone in 2 years. I thought it might be exaggeration. Turns out it wasn't. Ethan felt heat climb up the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the stove. He's easy to cook for once you figure him out. He's impossible, Nate said. Believe me, I grew up with him. He watched Ethan plate the short rib, steam curling up between them in the low kitchen light, and something quieted in his face. Not just exhaustion easing, but something else, something that made the room feel smaller and warmer all at once. Thank you. For him. And for this, eat your food, Mr. Calloway. Nate, he corrected, soft. You already knew that. Ethan set the plate down in front of him, and did not, for a very long moment, remember how to look away. After that night, something shifted quietly, and without either of them announcing it, the way spring arrives before you notice the trees have changed. Nate started coming home earlier. Not every night. The company was still recovering from the Fielding collapse, and there were weeks Ethan barely saw him. But often enough that Ethan began, guiltily, to plan dinners around the possibility of him. You made short rib again, Nate observed one evening in January, settling onto his usual stool at the island like he'd been doing it his whole life instead of 6 weeks. I made short rib because your father requested it, and I am contractually obligated to feed the man who signs my checks whatever he wants. Ethan didn't look up from the pan. If you happen to also eat some, that's incidental. Incidental, Nate repeated, deadpan. And Ethan caught the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth before he hid it in his water glass. It became a rhythm. Ethan cooking. Nate perched at the island with his tie loosened and his guard slowly, visibly coming down over the course of a meal, the two of them trading barbs across the kitchen like they'd been doing it for years. Walter, for his part, watched the whole thing unfold from his spot in the sunroom with the smug satisfaction of a man who suspected he'd engineered something and fully intended to take credit for it later. You know he hired you specifically because Nathaniel mentioned you, Mrs. Dobbins told Ethan one afternoon, apropos of nothing, while they shelled peas together at the kitchen table. Walter, I mean. Nathaniel came home from that Thanksgiving business absolutely useless for a week, kept forgetting to eat, which for that man is a full psychological event, and when Walter finally got it out of him, Nathaniel mentioned some caterer in Queens who'd chewed him out on a sidewalk over a turkey. Ethan nearly dropped the pea pod he was holding. He did not. He absolutely did. Walter called his lawyer within the hour to find out who you were. She smiled, unhurried, the smile of a woman who'd been managing this family's business for 30 years and had seen far stranger things engineered over far less. That old man doesn't do anything by accident, dear, including this. Ethan thought about that for the rest of the day, thought about it while he butchered a chicken, thought about it while he walked the frost-crusted grounds to clear his head, Thought about it that evening when Nate came in from the cold with snow melting in his dark hair and said, entirely too casually, I was thinking of skiing this weekend, up near the Berkshires. My father won't go. He says it's a sport for people who enjoy pain, but I thought if you weren't busy. Are you asking me on a date, Mr. Calloway? Nate's ears went faintly, satisfyingly pink. I'm asking if you'd like to see snow that isn't attached to a grocery list. That's the worst way anyone has ever asked me anything. I've been told I'm better at logistics than romance. You stole a turkey off a window ledge to get my attention. I think you're better at romance than you give yourself credit for. Nate looked at him then, really looked, snow still melting unheeded in his hair, and something in his expression went soft and unguarded in a way Ethan had only seen once before. That first midnight in the kitchen, over shortbread and short rib, before either of them had a name for what was happening between them. Come skiing with me, Nate said. Quiet now. All the performance gone out of it. Please. Yeah, Ethan said, and felt the word land somewhere warm and permanent in his chest. Okay, yes. The thing about being an omega, a thing Ethan had known intellectually his entire life and understood, viscerally, for the first time on a chairlift somewhere above the Berkshires, with Nate's arm braced warm along the back of the seat behind him, was that some truths didn't arrive through thinking. They arrived through the body, unannounced, all at once. He'd never given his own biology much thought. He took his suppressants on schedule, same as anyone, kept his cycles quiet and manageable, had never once in 27 years felt the particular catastrophic pull that Omega Alpha stories always described with such breathless certainty. He'd started to suspect it was mostly fiction, a narrative convenience, like love at first sight, invented by people who needed a reason for falling too fast. Then Nate laughed at something Ethan said, low and unguarded, the wind carrying the sound of it right up against Ethan's ear, and something in Ethan's chest simply opened. Not desire, exactly, though there was that too. Something quieter and more frightening. Recognition. The specific, bone-deep sense of there you are, as though some part of him had been listening for this exact voice his whole life without knowing it. You've gone quiet, Nate said, watching him with the same careful attention he brought to everything. Boardrooms and turkeys, and now, apparently, Ethan's face. Are you cold? No. Ethan shook his head, throat tight. No, I'm fine. He wasn't fine. He was falling, the specific vertiginous fall of a man who had spent his whole life assuming certain things happened to other people, and finding out, mid-air, that he'd been wrong. They didn't ski so much as fall down the mountain together, laughing, Nate hopeless on anything steeper than a bunny slope, despite 3 private lessons as a child that he swore indignantly should have taught him something. They ate dinner at a lodge with a fire crackling in a stone hearth the size of a car, and Nate told him, quietly, over wine, in the unguarded voice he seemed to save only for kitchens and firelight, about his mother, who had died when he was 19, and how his father had gone quiet and hard for 2 years afterward, until Nate had learned to run the company almost by accident, filling a silence no one else could stand to sit in. Is that why you took it private? Ethan asked. So you wouldn't have a board looking over your shoulder while you figured out how to breathe again? Nate looked at him for a long moment, firelight moving gold across his face. No one's ever asked me that before. Everyone assumes it was strategy. It was strategy. It just wasn't only that. No, Nate agreed, quiet. It wasn't only that. They walked back to the cabin through snow that squeaked underfoot, and at the door Nate stopped, turned, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth coming off him even through 2 coats. I want to kiss you, Nate said, with the same startling directness he'd used to accuse a stranger of turkey neglect 2 months earlier. I have wanted to since a sidewalk in November. I'm telling you instead of just doing it because I don't want you to feel like this is, like I hired you and then decided this was included. Something in Ethan's chest cracked open, warm and aching. You are the single most considerate turkey thief I have ever met. Is that a yes? Nate. Ethan reached up, curled a hand into the lapel of his coat, and pulled him down the rest of the way himself. That's a yes. The kiss was slow and searching and cold-lipped at first, warming fast, Nate's hand coming up careful against Ethan's jaw like he thought Ethan might startle and bolt if he moved too fast. And Ethan, who had spent his whole life certain that the bone-deep, world-narrowing pull of scent bond stories was exaggeration, understood in that single suspended moment exactly how wrong he had been. Nate smelled like cedar and cold air and something warmer underneath, something that made Ethan's whole body settle, like a held breath finally released. When they broke apart, foreheads still touching, Nate huffed out a laugh, unsteady. "For the record," he said, "I've never once stolen a turkey before or since. I want that on file somewhere." "Noted," Ethan said, laughing against his mouth. "One-time offense. Extenuating circumstances." "What circumstances? You saw me and panicked. It happens to the best of us." Nate kissed him again instead of answering, which Ethan decided to take as agreement. It should be said, for the record, that the groundhog was not Ethan's fault. It happened on a Sunday morning in late January, barely more than a week since the ski lodge, the two of them still finding their footing in the strange, wonderful new fact of dating, whatever exactly that meant for a chef living under his boyfriend's father's roof. Nate had promised to come up for the whole weekend, a rare stretch of 2 uninterrupted days, and Ethan had spent the better part of the morning wrestling a stubborn compost bin at the edge of the kitchen garden when he heard Mrs. Dobbins scream from the back porch. Not a small scream either, but the full-throated, operatic kind usually reserved for horror movies. He arrived at a dead sprint, spatula still in hand from the eggs he'd abandoned on the stove, to find Mrs. Dobbins standing on a porch chair, and a groundhog, fat, unbothered, magnificently entitled, sitting directly in the middle of the kitchen doorway like it owned the estate outright. "It just walked in," Mrs. Dobbins said, from her chair, with the wounded dignity of a woman betrayed by nature itself, like it had an appointment. "Okay," Ethan said, entirely too calmly for a man holding a spatula like a weapon. "Okay. It's a groundhog. It's more scared of us than we are of it. I am considerably more scared of it than it appears to be of me, Ethan. Look at its face." The groundhog, for its part, looked extremely unbothered by the entire proceeding and had begun, with great focus, investigating the leg of the kitchen table. What followed was 15 chaotic minutes that Ethan would later describe, to anyone who asked, as the least dignified moment of my professional career, involving a broom, an overturned recycling bin, Mrs. Dobbins shouting increasingly specific tactical advice from her chair, and Ethan attempting to herd a groundhog out the back door using nothing but a spatula and sheer force of will, right up until the exact moment Nate walked in the front door, 12 hours earlier than expected, having finished his calls faster than planned and driven straight up, and found his boyfriend of exactly 9 days sprinting through the front hall shouting, get the door, he's headed for the study." Nate, to his enormous credit, did not ask a single question. He simply opened the study door, stepped neatly out of the way, and watched with an expression of pure, delighted disbelief as the groundhog shot past him and out into the yard like it had somewhere very important to be. Silence settled over the front hall. Ethan, breathing hard, spatula still raised like a sword, became slowly aware of how he must look. Hair full, one sock missing, an actual leaf stuck to his shirt for reasons he genuinely could not explain, and felt his face go hot. "I can explain," he said. "Please don't," Nate said, grinning wider than Ethan had ever seen him grin, wider than seemed physically reasonable for a man who ran board meetings for a living. "This is, without competition, the best homecoming I have ever had." There was a groundhog in the kitchen, I gathered. It was very determined, I could tell. Nate crossed the hall, still grinning, and pulled Ethan in by the waist, entirely unbothered by the leaf, the missing sock, or the spatula still clutched in one hand. "You defended my father's house from a wild animal with a kitchen utensil. I think I might actually be in love with you." "You might be? I'm doing the math. Give me a second." He kissed Ethan's temple, laughing against his hair. "Yes. Confirmed. Entirely, completely in love with you. This is definitely the moment that did it. A groundhog did it. Not the cooking, not the everything else. A groundhog." "A groundhog," Nate agreed solemnly, "was the final decisive factor." Mrs. Dobbins, still perched on her chair in the kitchen doorway, called out, in tones of enormous long-suffering patience, "Is somebody going to help me down, or are you two simply going to stand there being in love at each other all afternoon?" "Both," Nate called back, not moving an inch, forehead pressed to Ethan's. "Give us a minute." It took considerably longer than a minute. Mrs. Dobbins, to her credit, waited it out with only moderate complaining. They didn't tell anyone right away. Not because there was anything to hide, but because Ethan wanted, selfishly, to keep it small for a while. A secret warmth he could carry around the kitchen with him, tucked against his ribs, like a coal he didn't want to share the heat of just yet. It didn't stay secret long. Nothing at Willow Ridge ever did, not with Mrs. Dobbins, running the household like an intelligence agency with excellent taste in linens. "You're humming," she informed Ethan, not long after the groundhog had made its dramatic exit, watching him whisk eggs with a small, involuntary smile he hadn't noticed on his own face. "You never hum, you mutter, usually about oven temperatures. I don't know what you're talking about." She began setting the table with the serene, satisfied air of a woman who had in fact known exactly what she was talking about since November. "Well, whatever it is, keep doing it. This house could use more humming." What followed was, in Ethan's private accounting, the happiest month of his life, made almost entirely of small things. Nate learning, badly, to help with prep, hopeless with a knife, endearing in his stubborn insistence on trying anyway, until Ethan finally confiscated the cutting board and assigned him to official taste tester, a job Nate performed with theatrical seriousness that made Walter, watching from the sunroom doorway, laugh so hard he had to sit down. There were mornings Ethan woke before the house did and found Nate already awake beside him, just watching him with an expression too soft for a man who ran board meetings like military campaigns. There were evenings they ended up dancing badly in the kitchen to whatever was on the radio, flour on both their hands, Walter shouting complaints about the noise from 2 rooms away that fooled absolutely no one, because he always turned the volume up on his own television to match. "You're different when you're here," Ethan told him one night, tracing idle patterns against Nate's chest in the dark. "Softer, slower, I like it. You're the only place I get to be like this," Nate admitted quiet into Ethan's hair. "Everywhere else I have to be Nathaniel Calloway. Here I just get to be, whatever this is, whoever I actually am underneath it. That's the guy I fell for," Ethan said. "Not the CTO, the idiot who stole a turkey because he panicked. I will never live that down." "No," Ethan agreed, smiling against his shoulder. "You won't. I intend to bring it up at our wedding, if we ever have one, and possibly at both our funerals." Nate went very still at that, in a way Ethan noticed even half asleep, and pressed a kiss to the crown of his head that felt, somehow, like a promise neither of them said out loud yet. It was Walter who broke the news to the wider family circle, entirely without asking permission, at a dinner in early February meant to celebrate nothing in particular. "My son," Walter announced, over dessert, to an assembled handful of Calloway cousins and family friends who had come up for the weekend, "has finally shown some sense." He raised his glass toward Ethan, sitting frozen with a fork halfway to his mouth. "About time, too. I was beginning to think I'd raised a hopeless case." "Dad," Nate said, mortified. "We hadn't exactly. Everyone with eyes already knows," Walter said, unbothered. I'm simply the first one willing to say it out loud at a dinner table." "Ethan, welcome to the family officially, whether either of you had gotten around to making it official or not." Ethan, laughing helplessly, looked across the table at Nate, who was pink to the ears, exasperated, and entirely, obviously happy underneath it, and thought, not for the first time, that he had never once expected his life to end up here, and had also never once, in all his imagining, dreamed up anything half as good. If Ethan had learned anything from 27 years of watching other people's happy endings collapse in real time on reality television, it was that nothing good ever arrived without someone showing up to complicate it. In this particular story, the someone arrived on a Tuesday in mid-February, not 2 weeks after Walter's announcement, driving a car worth more than Ethan's entire catering business, and his name was Sebastian Cole. "Old family friend," Mrs. Dobbins said, in the flat tone of a woman choosing every word with the care of someone diffusing something. "Omega." His father and Walter went to school together. There was talk years ago of Sebastian and Nathaniel. "Talk," Ethan repeated, "an understanding. Never a formal arrangement, but the families always assumed. Sebastian's father still assumes, I believe. Whatever Nathaniel might feel about it." Ethan met Sebastian for the first time in the front hall, shaking rain off an umbrella that probably cost more than Ethan's rent, and understood immediately, with the flat clarity of a man reading a menu he already knew he wouldn't order from, exactly what kind of complication this was going to be. Sebastian was handsome in the effortless magazine cover way that made Ethan self-conscious of the flour still dusted along his forearms, and he looked at Ethan. Catalogued him really head to foot with the particular blankness of someone deciding how much space you were worth taking up in a room. "You must be the chef," Sebastian said, in a voice like cool silk. "Nathaniel's mentioned you." Sort of," Ethan repeated, and did not, with tremendous effort, ask what sort of was supposed to mean. He found out that evening, at a dinner Walter had insisted on hosting, for old time's sake, which Ethan suspected was code for watch this unfold and see what happens, where Sebastian spent an hour and a half being effortlessly, devastatingly charming in a way that made Nate laugh twice, actually laugh, at old stories Ethan had no context for and no claim to. Ethan told himself it didn't matter. He told himself this while plating dessert with hands that were not, in fact, entirely steady. He told himself this again later, alone in the kitchen scraping pans, when he overheard, not eavesdropping, exactly, just standing very still near an open door, Sebastian's voice drifting in from the hall. "Your father still hopes, you know," Sebastian was saying, warm and low. "So does mine. It wouldn't have to be complicated, Nate. We know each other. We fit in all the ways that matter for a life like this one." There was a pause, long enough that Ethan's whole body went cold wading through it. Sebastian. Nate's voice, careful, gentle, in the specific way people are gentle when they're about to disappoint someone they don't want to hurt. "You're a good friend, you always have been. But that's what you are. Because of the chef?" "Because of me," Nate said, and something in his voice sharpened, certain. "I'm not interested in fitting into a life that was decided for me before I was old enough to have an opinion about it. I want the thing that surprised me, not the thing that was arranged." Ethan set down the pan he was holding very, very carefully, because his hands had started shaking for an entirely different reason now, and stood in the dark kitchen with his heart going absurdly fast, feeling, for one unguarded, undefended moment, entirely, gloriously chosen. He should have known it wouldn't be that simple. Sebastian, to his credit, did not disappear quietly. He stayed through the following week, ostensibly visiting his own family nearby, though Ethan suspected the timing was no accident, and made a point, twice, of finding Ethan alone in the kitchen when Nate was out. "I'm not your enemy," Sebastian told him the second time, leaning in the doorway with the particular ease of someone who had never once doubted he belonged wherever he stood. "I know how this looks. I promise you, I'm not trying to undo anything." "Could have fooled me," Ethan said, not looking up from the dough he was folding. "My father wants what he wants. I stopped being able to control that a long time ago." Something flickered across Sebastian's face, there and gone, that Ethan almost mistook for tiredness. "For what it's worth, Nate's happier than I've seen him in years. I noticed it the moment I walked in. I'm not blind, whatever else I am." Ethan set the dough down, surprised into stillness. "Then why keep pushing?" "Because it's easier to let my father believe I'm still trying than to have the fight that tells him I've given up." Sebastian's mouth twisted, wry, and a little sad. "You'll understand, eventually, that some family expectations don't end with a single conversation. They end slowly, in 100 small refusals, until the person doing the expecting finally runs out of hope on his own." It wasn't quite an apology, and it wasn't quite a truce, but Ethan found himself softening toward the other man in spite of himself. Enough, at least, to nod once and go back to his dough, and to stop, for the first time since the rainy Tuesday Sebastian had arrived, dreading the sound of his car in the driveway. He didn't understand the full shape of what was happening. Not yet. Not until Nate left for Singapore 3 weeks later and the silence started. But he understood enough, standing in that kitchen, to know that whatever came next wasn't going to be decided by anyone but Nate himself. The trouble, when it came, arrived the way most real trouble does. Not through malice, but through silence. It started with a business trip. 3 weeks in Singapore, restructuring talks for a new Pacific logistics contract that Nate needed personally, urgently, given how badly the fielding deal had bruised the company's reputation. He left in a rush of packed bags and rescheduled calls, kissed Ethan hard and quick in the kitchen doorway at 5 in the morning, and said, "I'll call, I promise. This one actually matters," in a voice that made Ethan believe him completely. He called for the first 4 days. Then the calls thinned, then stopped, replaced by short, distracted texts that arrived at odd hours and trailed off mid-thought. Ethan told himself it was the time difference. He told himself it was the deal. He told himself several other reasonable things, right up until Mrs. Dobbins found him standing very still in the pantry one evening, staring at nothing, a can of tomatoes forgotten in his hand. "He hasn't called," Ethan admitted, before she could ask. "In 4 days." And Sebastian texted his father something, and his father called Walter, and Walter's been on the phone all afternoon, looking like he's swallowing something unpleasant, and nobody will tell me what's going on, and I am starting to feel very stupid. Mrs. Dobbins, for thinking any of this was real. Oh, honey. Mrs. Dobbins's face did something complicated. Pity and irritation in equal measure, though not, Ethan would later understand, irritation at him. Sebastian's father is trying to force a merger through the marriage he never got to make happen the first time. He's using the Singapore negotiations as leverage, implying his firm's Pacific contacts come as a package deal with his son. It's an old, ugly kind of business, and Nathaniel is currently drowning in it, which is precisely why he hasn't called. He's trying to protect you from watching him fight it, by disappearing, by being an idiot, Mrs. Dobbins said flatly. The way men in this family have been doing for 3 generations, whenever they decide protecting someone, means going quiet instead of talking to them. Ethan set down the can of tomatoes. Something hot and clarifying moved through him. Not quite anger, something closer to resolve. Where's Walter? Sunroom. Why? Because, Ethan said, already untying his apron, I am done sitting in a kitchen upstate feeling stupid while a man I am completely, humiliatingly in love with fights a business war on the other side of the planet without telling me it's happening. I need a flight to Singapore, and I need Walter's help getting one on this short of notice. Because I guarantee you the old man has connections I don't, Mrs. Dobbins's face broke into the widest smile Ethan had ever seen on her. Now that's the boy I hired you to be. Walter, it turned out, had connections that made a same-day business-class ticket to Singapore look like the easiest phone call he'd made all year, and by the time Ethan landed, jet-lagged, wrinkled, running on airplane coffee and sheer stubbornness, he had also, somewhere over the Pacific, decided exactly what he wanted to say. He found Nate not in a boardroom, but in a hotel suite at 11 at night, tie gone, shirt untucked, staring at a spreadsheet with the specific hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man who had forgotten again to eat. Ethan? Nate stood so fast his chair nearly went over. What are you? How did you? Is my father all right? Your father's fine. He helped me steal you a plane ticket, actually, which I think might be his new favorite hobby. Ethan set down his bag and crossed the room before he could lose his nerve. You went quiet on me. And I let myself think for 4 days that it was because none of this was real. And then your father's housekeeper informed me that you're currently letting Sebastian's father blackmail you into a merger you don't want, because you'd rather protect me from watching you lose than let me actually be in this with you. And I flew 14 hours to tell you that's not how this works. I don't need protecting from your bad weeks, Nate. I need you to let me stand in them with you. Nate stared at him, something raw moving across his face. I didn't want you to see me lose. I don't care if you lose. I care that you disappeared instead of telling me you were scared. Ethan's voice cracked, and he let it, because he was too tired and too far from home to perform composure anymore. I fell for a man who steals turkeys off window ledges because he panics and does something instead of nothing. Don't turn into someone who does nothing the second things get hard. That's not the man I flew 14 hours for. For a long moment Nate just looked at him, and then slowly, something in his shoulders came down, like a wall finally admitting it was tired of standing. Cole's father wants me to fold the Pacific contract into an engagement, Nate said quietly. He's implying, not quite saying outright, that his firm's contacts walk if Sebastian and I don't reconsider. I've spent 4 days trying to find a way to save the deal without giving him what he wants, and I couldn't figure out how to tell you any of it without it, sounding like I was asking you to compete for a place in my life that should already be yours. So tell them no, Ethan said simply. Tell them the deal's not worth trading your life for. You told me yourself. You took the company private so you wouldn't have to answer to people who think they get to decide who you love. Don't let an old man's ego undo that now. Nate huffed out something that was almost a laugh, disbelief, and relief tangled together. You flew across the world to tell me to just say no. I flew across the world, Ethan said, closing the last of the distance between them. Because I love you. And I wasn't going to let you fight this alone in a hotel room with cold takeout and a spreadsheet for company. The rest is just details. You love me, Nate repeated, quiet, like he was tasting the words. I've loved you since you laughed at a poorly breened turkey on a sidewalk in November, and I decided, against every ounce of my own good judgment, that I wanted to hear you laugh again. Ethan reached up, curled his hand into Nate's collar the way he had that first night at the ski lodge, and felt Nate's arms come around him at last, solid and certain, all the tension of 4 silent days finally breaking loose between them. So, are you going to say no to Sebastian's father, or am I going to have to do it myself? Because I promise you, I will. Nate laughed, really laughed, the sound Ethan had crossed an ocean to hear again, and kissed him, slow and grateful and sure, right there in a hotel room in Singapore at 11 at night, 14,000 kilometers from home, and finally exactly where they were both supposed to be. He called Sebastian's father the next morning and said no. The Pacific contract nearly fell apart over it, and then didn't, because it turned out Calloway Industries had built its reputation on being the firm that didn't fold under pressure, and 3 other partners came forward within the week, eager to work with a man who couldn't be bought. They stayed in Singapore 2 extra days, officially for closing logistics, unofficially because neither of them could quite bring themselves to get back on a plane yet. They ate noodles from a stall Nate swore was the best in the city and turned out to be right about, wandered the gardens by the bay at night with their fingers laced together under the glow of the super trees, and slept in late for the first time in months. Tangled together in a hotel bed, with the curtains open to a skyline, neither of them was in any hurry to leave. "I keep thinking about what you said," Nate murmured on their last night, tracing slow circles against the back of Ethan's hand. "About standing in it with you. I don't think anyone's ever actually asked me for that before. Everyone in my life either needs something from me or wants to protect me from needing anything at all. You just showed up. 14 hours on a plane, no plan, just showed up and told me to stop being an idiot. That's the whole plan, generally," Ethan said. "Show up, tell you when you're being an idiot, feed you something warm afterward. It's not complicated. It is to me. I had to learn it from scratch. Well," Ethan pressed a kiss to his temple, unhurried, certain. "You're a fast study. Ask anyone who's watched you butcher a chicken breast, and then insist on trying again 3 more times out of pure spite." Nate laughed, the sound rough with relief and something deeper, something that had been loosening in his chest for days. "I love you," he said again, like he couldn't quite stop saying it now that he'd started, like it was a muscle he intended to make up for years of not using. "I love you, and I am never again going to let a bad week convince me that going quiet is easier than letting you in." "Good," Ethan said simply, "because I'm not going anywhere, not after all this." "You're stuck with me now, Calloway. Turkey thief for life. I can think of worse sentences." Spring came to Willow Ridge the way it always had, slow and green and unhurried, and Ethan spent it the way he'd never quite let himself imagine spending anything. Happily, without waiting for the other shoe to drop. Walter, fully recovered and insufferably pleased with himself, took to introducing Ethan at every opportunity as the chef who fixed my son, which Nate protested loudly and never quite managed to correct, mostly because it was infuriatingly true. It was Nate, in the end, who brought up the restaurant, casually, over coffee one Saturday morning, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You still want it, don't you?" he said, not really a question. "Your own place. Marcus mentioned it, the first week I ever spoke to him on the phone, and you talk about it in your sleep sometimes. You did it again last Tuesday. Something about a walk-in that finally works." Ethan felt his ears go warm. "It's a stupid daydream. I have a life here." "It's not stupid, and you don't have to choose." Nate slid a folded piece of paper across the table. A listing, a small storefront in the village 15 minutes from Willow Ridge, brick front, big windows, a for-lease sign visible even in the grainy printed photo. "I'm not buying it for you. I looked into it, and I'm not doing that, because you'd never forgive me and you'd be right not to, but I called in a favor with the landlord to hold it for 30 days so you could see it before someone else did. What you do with that is entirely up to you." Ethan stared at the paper for a long moment, throat tight. "You did this without telling me." "I did the looking without telling you. The deciding is still yours. It always will be." Nate reached across the table, covered Ethan's hand with his own. "I just didn't want you finding out in a year that the version of you who runs his own kitchen never got a real shot because you were too busy taking care of my family to take care of your own dream." Ethan called Marcus that same afternoon, and by the following weekend the two of them were standing in the empty storefront together, dust motes turning gold in the afternoon light, Marcus already pacing off where the pass would go with the single-minded focus of a man who had been waiting years for exactly this phone call. "We're doing this," Marcus said. Not a question either. "We're doing this," Ethan agreed and meant it all the way down. The next 6 months were a blur of contractors and permits, and late nights spent arguing happily with Marcus over floor plans at the kitchen island. Nate wandering in and out with takeout containers and opinions on paint colors that nobody had asked for, but that turned out infuriatingly to be good ones. Walter took to visiting the site once a week to supervise, which mostly meant sitting in a folding chair by the front window, offering unsolicited commentary, and on more than one occasion, quietly slipping Marcus a check for the specialty oven Ethan had been too proud to ask for outright. "You didn't have to do that," Ethan told him when he found out. "I know," Walter said. "I wanted to. There's a difference, same as with turkeys, apparently." He waved off further argument with the particular authority of a man who had spent 79 years getting the last word. "Besides, I intend to eat there every week for the rest of my life, and I refuse to do it in a kitchen with an oven that can't keep up. Purely selfish, I assure you." It wasn't selfish, and everyone in the room knew it, but Ethan let him have the lie, because some kindnesses were easier to accept when they were dressed up as something else. That night, standing alone in the half-finished dining room, with sawdust still clinging to his shoes, Ethan looked around at the bones of the place. The room that would, in a few short months, be entirely and finally his, and felt something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with fear at all, for the first time in longer than he could remember. The proposal, when it came a few months later, was so quiet Ethan almost missed it. No grand gesture, no orchestrated audience, just an ordinary Tuesday evening in the Willow Ridge kitchen, rain against the windows, a pot of something simmering on the stove, Nate leaning against the counter watching Ethan cook the way he always did, like it was the best part of his day. "Marry me," Nate said into the quiet, like it was the most natural sentence in the world. Ethan nearly dropped the spoon. "That's it? No ring. No speech, no getting down on one knee in front of a sunset." "I have a ring," Nate said mildly. "It's in my pocket. I was building up to it." "You interrupted." "I interrupted a proposal by reacting to the proposal." "You have a gift for chaos," Nate said fondly, and got down on one knee right there on the kitchen floor, flour dust and all, and held up a ring that caught the low evening light. "I love you. I have loved you since a sidewalk in November, and every ridiculous ordinary day since, in every kitchen you've ever fed me in. Marry me, Ethan. Let me steal something from you on purpose this time." "You already have," Ethan said, laughing and crying at once, sinking down to kneel with him on the kitchen floor because standing suddenly felt like too much to manage. "You already stole the whole thing. Yes, obviously, completely, yes." They were married in September, in the garden at Willow Ridge, under a canopy of white flowers Mrs. Dobbins had spent 2 months threatening the gardener into perfecting. Walter walked Nate down the makeshift aisle himself, cane in one hand and Nate's arm in the other, and cried without any apparent shame at all. Marcus stood as Ethan's best man and gave a toast that somehow, against all odds, mentioned the turkey exactly 4 times, and closed by announcing, to genuine, delighted uproar, that Bennett and Bell, the restaurant the two of them had spent the summer building out board by board, would open its doors in October, and that everyone in attendance had better show up, because Ethan would absolutely remember who didn't. Even Sebastian came, in the end, and danced once with the man he'd eventually find his own happy ending with, and told Ethan with real warmth that he was glad Nate had found someone who made him laugh like that. Under the flowers, hands joined, Nate leaned in close enough that only Ethan could hear him. "For the record," he murmured, "I'd steal 1,000 turkeys if it meant getting here again." "Please don't," Ethan whispered back, laughing. "One was traumatic enough." Nate kissed him anyway, right there in front of everyone, and Ethan understood, in the particular bone-deep way an Omega understands these things. The way that had once seemed like fiction and now felt like the truest thing he knew, that he had found, at last, exactly where he belonged. Willow Ridge in June smelled like cut grass and Ethan's rosemary, which had finally, after 2 years of stubborn negotiation with the estate's ancient soil, taken over an entire corner of the kitchen garden. Ethan stood in it barefoot, coffee in hand, watching his husband attempt, with the same grim determination he brought to hostile takeovers, to fix a garden gate that had been squeaking for exactly as long as they'd lived there full time. "You could just call someone," Ethan said. "I am someone." Nate did not look up from the hinge, which he had already dropped twice. "I run a $12 billion logistics company. I can fix a gate. You once tried to fix the toaster and set off the smoke alarm. That was a design flaw in the toaster. It was user error, Nate. I'm choosing not to engage with that." The hinge slipped a third time, and Nate said something under his breath that made Ethan laugh so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Walter appeared on the back porch in his robe, coffee of his own in hand, and surveyed the scene with the long-suffering patience of a man who had, in 2 years of retirement, discovered he enjoyed nothing quite so much as narrating his son's failures from a safe distance. $12 billion. Walter announced to no one in particular, and he can't fix a gate. Not you too, Nate said without turning around. I raised you better than this. You raised me to run a company, not to be a locksmith. I raised you, Walter said, settling into the porch chair with the air of a man preparing for a long and satisfying show, to know when to admit defeat and hand something to someone competent. Ethan. Fix the gate. Ethan set his coffee down, laughing, and crossed the garden to crouch beside his husband, who surrendered the screwdriver with the wounded dignity of a man conceding a very small, very personal war. You're supposed to be on my side, Nate muttered. I'm on the side of the gate not waking me up at 6 a.m. anymore. Ethan had it fixed in under a minute. A trick of the wrist Marcus had taught him years ago, fixing walk-in hinges in a dozen rented kitchens, and swung it open and shut, silent now, with visible satisfaction. There. See? Competence. Show off, Nate said, but he was smiling, the specific soft smile he still only ever wore around Ethan and his father, the one that had taken Ethan 2 years to stop being surprised by, and had never once stopped making his chest go warm. Bennett and Bell was 2 years old that same month, a small brick restaurant in the village that had, against every nervous prediction Ethan made in its first shaky quarter, turned a genuine profit by its second year and a line out the door most Friday nights. Marcus ran the front of house like a general and complained about it constantly, which everyone understood to mean he loved it more than anything he'd ever done. Nate came in most weeks, always at the counter, always ordering whatever Ethan told him to, and the regulars had long since stopped whispering about the fact that the reclusive Calloway heir sat there most Thursdays looking, for all the world, like the happiest man in the building. I love you, Ethan said, apropos of nothing, because some days the feeling simply overflowed and needed somewhere to go. I love you too, Nate said, easy as breathing now, and kissed him, right there in the garden, in front of his father, who made a loud and theatrical noise of complaint that fooled absolutely no one, because Walter Calloway had never once, in 2 years, missed an opportunity to watch his son be happy. That evening, the three of them ate dinner on the back porch as the light went gold and slow over the hills. Roast chicken, Ethan's rosemary, bread still warm from the oven, and Walter, halfway through his second glass of wine, announced entirely unprompted that he expected grandchildren eventually, dog or otherwise, and did not care which. We have a dog, Nate pointed out. Biscuit. He's asleep under the table right now. Biscuit doesn't count. Biscuit is a menace who ate my newspaper. He's a good boy, Ethan said, delivering a piece of chicken under the table to the good boy in question, who accepted it with the solemn gravity of a creature who knew exactly how loved he was. You're both hopeless, Walter said, but he was smiling too, wide and unguarded, in the easy gold evening light, surrounded by the noise of a family he'd once feared he'd have to grieve his way through alone. Feed me more chicken, Ethan, and somebody refill my wine. Yes, sir, Ethan said, laughing, and did. Later, once Walter had gone up to bed and Biscuit had claimed the porch cushion for himself, with the shameless entitlement of a dog who had never once been told no, Ethan and Nate stayed out under the darkening sky, dishes forgotten. Nate's arm slung loose and warm around Ethan's shoulders. He's not wrong, you know, Nate said after a while, watching the first stars come out over the hills. About wanting more noise in this house eventually. I've been thinking about it too. Ethan turned to look at him, something hopeful catching in his chest. Yeah? Not yet, but someday. If you wanted that. Nate's voice was careful, a little unsure in the way it only ever got when something mattered enormously to him. I never used to picture a future with anyone this specific. Now I picture one with you so easily it almost scares me. It doesn't scare me, Ethan said, leaning into him, listening to the steady, familiar sound of his husband's heartbeat under his ear. Someday sounds good, whatever shape it ends up taking. Dog, kid, both, neither, I just want it to be with you. Good, Nate said, pressing a kiss into his hair, the porch light catching gold in his dark eyes. Because that was never actually in question. Under the table, Nate had found his hand and held it, warm and certain, the way he had every evening for 2 years, and would, Ethan suspected, for every evening after that, Two men who had started with a stolen turkey and a sidewalk argument and ended up, against every reasonable expectation, exactly, permanently home.